Joel Skelly with KDOT on the road usage charge pilot in Kansas. Welcome to the committee, Joel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as the chairman said, my name is Joel Skelly, and I'm the Director of Policy for the Kansas Department of Transportation. I'm here to provide you guys with an informational briefing on what was explored and learned as a part of this study, which is, I think, coming up at some point. Sorry. There we are. So the Kansas Midwest Road Usage, or RUC, as you'll hear me call it, pilot and study. This information you probably are most likely familiar with, being a Kansan and serving on this committee. So the key takeaway I really want you to get from this slide is that as Kansans, we have a strong pride in our transportation system and tradition in maintaining a quality system that serves all. So how do we fund transportation investments? Again, you guys are all likely most familiar with this through a diverse set of funding. And why is it important? The state looks at how it funds its transportation investments. Well, you'll see on the slide here, essentially, that as we project and as fuel efficiency becomes higher in internal combustion engines and alternative fuel vehicles become more prevalent in our fleet, the revenue from fuel tax is going to start declining. So as you see here, a high estimate is by 2040, approximately 33% decline in that state motor fuels tax is what we could see if we do nothing. So in 2019, a little bit of background, the Joint Legislative Transportation Vision Task Force, which is a bit of a mouthful, and I do know at least one member who's sitting on this committee that was on that committee at this time, or at that time, in its recommendations said KDOT was to explore with partners funding alternatives, including a fee based on vehicle miles traveled, drawing on experiences from other states at various stages of the study and implementation of such a fee. So with that, we took it on and sought out federal funding to actually help us do this study. But before I get to that, I want to show you a little bit of a map here indicating kind of what's happening across the country and has been happening across the country for at least the last 5 to 6 years, if not longer in some cases. Some states like Oregon and Utah have had a road usage charge program or pilot in place for well over a decade. Several states otherwise are participating in research through coalitions. Few others do have pilots or actual programs, and there is a federal discussion happening about RUC as a future alternative funding mechanism. So a little bit about what we were exploring with our Midwest Kansas RUC study, and the first thing was bringing a Midwest voice to that national conversation. As you probably saw, and let me go back to it just to emphasize, those gray states really have not done anything related to RUC, whether it be research, exploration, a pilot, or anything. So there's a bit of a gap there. And we, prior to 2021, were also gray at that point. And actually, truthfully, Oklahoma was gray at that point. So there really was a bit of a gap from the Midwest as to what is our perspective, what's our voice, what's our consideration about road usage charge as an alternative funding mechanism. Let me go back to this slide. The other idea around our study was really focused on what that Joint Legislative Task Force asked us to do, and that is focus on exploring potential alternative revenue funding options for the state of Kansas in the future. And as I'd mentioned, we did seek out federal funding to help us do this study that were made available. All right, so a couple of the primary things I mentioned earlier include really is, could RUC as a user fee revenue help steer Kansas toward more equitable and sustainable funding? And secondarily, or as a second thing, what is the Kansas perception of RUC? So a bit of an explainer here on equitable and sustainable funding. When we talk about equitable funding, we're really talking about, or it could be considered more like parity. I know we've used that phrase in this in this committee, especially related to House Bill 2121, where it's looking at providing more parity across the different vehicle types as far as fuel and non-fuel vehicles. So in this slide here, what I want you to take from this is looking at it from a parity standpoint. This is currently, as it stands today, if an average vehicle were to drive 12,000 miles, about what they would pay and split out how they pay that. So looking at it from the far left, you have an electric vehicle. Currently, they pay a registration fee. They don't pay anything in motor fuels tax because they don't purchase any motor fuel. Whereas then an internal combustion engine on the other side of that at over 4,500 pounds would estimate approximately 18 miles per gallon, would pay approximately $200 or $323 annually. Now this all includes federal motor fuels tax. So that's something I want to make sure that you recognize. It's not just we're considering the state revenues that we're collecting. It also is collection on the federal funds that we do get formula dollars back from the federal government once that's collected. And as I'd mentioned earlier, this is based on the current fees as of February 2025, but we all know that 2121 has made it across to the Senate. So if that were to become law, that would change how this graph looks. So start here with a few caveats, or a couple of caveats on the next couple of slides. There are a lot of variables that can affect this projection. And two, this is for illustrative use only. Really, this is not a recommendation one way or another. This is to help show kind of what are some options out there, what is projection here. So again, this slide here shows kind of what I spoke about earlier as to the sustainability of motor fuels tax. As you progress years out, vehicles that are new purchases are going to be more fuel efficient or alternative fuel potentially than what the current vehicles are today. And right now, our trends, we're seeing about a 4.5% fleet changeover every year. So about 4%. Roughly translates, you'll see about people trade in or move on to a new vehicle maybe about every 11, 12 years on average. Some people far more often, some people far less often. So we used, and this at the top, it talks about slow EV growth. So we used that throughout all of the projections and through the study that we looked at because of our trends that we're seeing in Kansas. We don't see high adoption rates of electric vehicles being purchased right now. And so over these past half a dozen years that electric vehicles really have started catching on, we're not seeing a huge increase. We are seeing an increase. There's a trend where people are buying more electric vehicles. And I do believe Representative Hoheisel has still got it on his list to get a Cybertruck at some point. So that could add another vehicle into the fleet at some point in time. Again, we wanted to be conservative in these estimates when we're looking at it because we don't see that growth. This all is dynamic and can be changed as we further evaluate and kind of see new trends happening. So here's the second slide, and well, you can kind of see it. Essentially, this shows an illustrative option to consider if you were to replace the EV registration rate with an EV road usage charge fee on those light duty vehicles. That orange sliver is about what it would potentially raise to help fill the gap. It's not going to fill the entire gap. So I want to be clear, this is not a solution, an immediate solution, nor a one fixed solution. There are several things that have to be considered as we as a state explore revenue funding for transportation investment. And I think I'd mentioned this, but I want to repeat it if I didn't mention it. The current percentage of the fleet of vehicles in Kansas is about 0.5% right now of EVs. So of the total fleet of registered vehicles across the state, it's about 0.5%. Under this projection with slow growth, we would anticipate to see that rise by 2040 to about 5.5%. So again, not a lot. And that could change. It could change to be less, it could change to be more. Our crystal ball isn't clear. That's part of the reason why we're looking at this and having these conversations.
So Joel,
Yes, sir.
can you just
Yes.
clarify for all of us? If EVs are the problem, why doesn't it solve the problem?
Happy
Or are
to.
you going to
Great.
get to that in a minute?
Great question, and I was going to get to it in a minute, but I think we'll go right there because that's a great question and that's a very important topic. I started to allude to this a little earlier, but the main reason for a lot of this decline is fuel efficiency of those internal combustion engines. We aren't seeing vehicle miles traveled drop, so it's not a matter of people are buying less fuel because they're driving fewer miles. It's because in general, people are buying less fuel because as they get new vehicles, they have better fuel efficiency. So people are getting more miles per gallon, which means they're buying less gallons, which means they're paying less motor fuels tax. Motor fuels tax is calculated on a gallon rate. So it's not based on the value of the cost of the gas. It's based on every gallon. 24 cents for motor fuel in Kansas and 26 cents for diesel. Again, a gallon of gas could be $2.50 now, I think, or something around that neighborhood. Tomorrow could be $3.50. The state is still only going to get 24 cents of that, $2.50 or $3.50 for every gallon that's purchased. So it is based on that amount of gallons purchased. And that amount we're seeing will decline or is projected to decline as vehicles continue to become more fuel efficient. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's a great question to have asked. That was a nice softball. I like that. I'm sure there are others, I'm hoping, in the wings. So as we move on through this presentation, through the informational briefing here, I want to take you through some of what we did during the study in the pilot and some of what we learned and heard from folks that we engaged throughout the pilot. The study was intended to provide a couple primary functions. I think I've mentioned some of this. Learn about the perception and viability of RUC as a Kansas alternative funding mechanism and provide that Midwest voice at a national level. I want to mention here too that you'll see throughout this study, we tried to hold true to our longstanding tradition of being collaborative with our partners and with Kansans. You see that throughout our local consultation process that we've done for several years. We wanted to make sure that we were hearing from Kansans because that's what we need to do. We need to represent what our citizenry ultimately expects and sees. So moving into the first phase, which was stakeholder outreach. You'll see on the right, there's some highlights of some of the stuff that we heard when we started our engagement, and our engagement started really with larger stakeholder groups to get the information out about what the study was and what it was looking for, and then to really get engaged with some of these groups. And you'll see some of the major groups that we started this engagement with at the very onset, and to seek their assistance in helping to get the word out and find folks that would be willing to kind of participate in or talk to, listen to for us as far as learning about those ideas and perceptions across the state. So we continued fostering those conversations and those partnerships really throughout the course of the study. Didn't just stop at the end of phase one. So as we moved into phase two, the attention for phase two was really to delve deeper into user preferences at a more individual level. You'll see across the state there a smattering of dots. Those all represent an individual meeting, a work session that we had members of our team on the study had drove around, and you'll see there's highlighted lines across the highways there. That's the route that they actually took when they went around to visit these folks. A lot of them were typically like kitchen table conversations. We'd meet at libraries if they wanted, but we had requested, but through some of this engagement through our stakeholder groups, for folks to identify different people that would be willing to have this kind of 90-minute work session to talk a little bit about what they thought and learn a little more about just general topics tied to transportation, tied to how they pay their bills, like what their preferences are, as far as do you like getting electronic billing? Do you prefer to have a written statement? Those sorts of things, really to start gauging what are people's typical preferences to see if there's something in this type of mechanism that could help make that more feasible or as an option. And maybe it wouldn't. So in any case, really what this did was to help us better design the pilot that we were going to be implementing here in phase 3. So as we move into phase 3, some of the key questions you'll see there on the right really were generated from those conversations that we had in both phase 1 and in phase 2. It really identified, okay, here's what we need to focus in on when we're looking at this pilot and designing what the pilot would look like, how it would operate. And then the hallmarks really was what we heard from folks. They wanted transparency, clear pilot objectives, accessible, straightforward, no persuasion. So in other words, we heard, we don't want to be persuaded that this is the thing that we should do, which we heard loud and clear, and that's not what our intention ever was. We wanted to learn more about that. Choice. People wanted to hear more about what are some choices that they might have in how to do this. In previous pilots across the country, we learned from folks across the states that did these. A lot of times they just handed somebody a device and said, go out and drive. And so if they wanted to do it, then they had to take that specific device or whatever it was and use it and follow those instructions. So we wanted to take it a step back and actually say, we'll design this around what our user preferences are. Not specifically just what the state agency or the state thought, but what those users that were going to use it thought. And then last was, but not least, is fairness. We heard they wanted accountability for everyone. So anybody that uses it, they wanted accountability for. So you couldn't cheat the system. That was a big thing. All right. So a little bit about the research and the pilot that we did. We did mileage reporting, and I'll get to this in a minute. We had some options for how people would report their mileage. It lasted for 3 months. For folks that weren't able to participate, because we did have a cap on what we could actually do for the participation as far as numbers of people, and I'll get to that as well. We had also a ruck estimator, what we called it. So it was on a website where people, if they couldn't participate, or even if they could participate, they could enter in a vehicle type, year, make, model, and then give an estimate of how many miles they drove on average, and that would take from a database of known vehicle miles per gallon on those vehicle types, and then estimate based on a rate of vehicle miles traveled, what they would have paid, and then an amount of motor fuels tax that they likely would have paid to drive those same miles, to help give them a better sense of, okay, well, how is this comparable? How does this work? I mean, here's what I'm paying. So it was twofold. One, to be able to help show folks that were interested about what those options might look like, as well as to learn for us as to what people's preferences might be. Oh, well, actually, let me back up a second here. I skipped over the last thing, and really this is a key thing. We learned a lot from this pilot based on survey responses that we got, that we did a pre-pilot survey and a post-pilot survey of all the folks that participated. We got 98% response. That's like amazing. We were extremely impressed and happy, satisfied with that response rate. It was just really amazing at the beginning. And then we only lost like 7%. So we were still above 90% on our survey responses as far as that goes. So that was something that we were really happy with. And it gave us a lot of good feedback and information. And that's really what we were seeking and searching for. All right. A little bit about the participants, which I'm guessing you might be interested in. I mentioned we had a limited number we could really do, and that was based on our budget, essentially, that we had to do this entire study. We had about 570 almost participants. Now, I will tell you up front, when we first started this study, not having a whole lot of experience with these things, I was hoping and expecting we were going to be able to do a few thousand people. And I quickly learned that, one, that's not necessarily as easy as you might think to get that number of people to follow through all the way through the pilot. But two, it's also can be fairly expensive. So we did offer, in order to get people engaged in this, an actual a gift card essentially to participate. So they could get a small amount of money at the beginning, and then if they went through the entire process, they could get some additional funding. I've learned a lot about the fact that you do get a lot of attrition, even with that. People like, oh yeah, I think I'd like to do that. And then when you follow through for folks to say, yeah, sign up, let's get this thing going, doesn't always happen. So still, this was kind of a goal where we were shooting for about a little over 500 to 600 people. The map, you'll see, we split this out. This is our 6 KDOT districts, essentially, the colored squares or shapes, essentially. In those circles, the yellow percentage is the percent of the participants in the pilot from that region. And then the percentage below it is actually the percent of population in that region compared to the statewide population. Reason I point that out is because we were specifically focused on oversampling in the rural areas of the state. We didn't want to exclude urban and suburban, but our focus was again looking at the rural areas of the state. So you might notice like the northeast portion said 37% that was participants in the pilot. Well, it's less than equal to the ratio of total population in that region, which was 55%. And then if you look at, say, the southwest portion, there's about 2% of the total state population here in that region, and we sampled and had 8% of the folks that were participants in the pilot. Again, that was strategic, that was focused, that was actually something that we did on purpose. We wanted to make sure that we were sampling across the state, but also making sure that we had good representation from those rural parts of the state. And even in the Northeast or say the South Central, just because there were people there, it doesn't necessarily mean they were in Wichita or Kansas City. But there were some that were. All right, so next I'm going to cover some findings that we learned from our pilot experience, from the surveys, as I'd mentioned, and the help desk feedback that we received. First thing was really tied to the preferences. So I mentioned we gave folks 4 options, or maybe I didn't mention the 4. We gave them options ultimately to choose as far as what would be their mileage-based reporting mechanism. So there were 4. One was pretty simply just an online form. They would sign up, and at the beginning of the 3 months, they would enter in their odometer reading. And then at the end of the 3 months, they would enter in their odometer reading. And then they would be charged based on the number of miles that was. So that was very simple. Removes some concerns from privacy issues, but it also doesn't necessarily help you with, is it accurate? Is it really what's on that odometer reading? Because it's you're trusting the people to actually provide that information accurately, one, whether it's intentional or unintentional. And then it also doesn't represent whether you're driving on private property or out of state. The idea was, how do we recoup state motor fuels tax with some of this study? Not necessarily how do we recoup federal motor fuels tax. That's another conversation that we want to be a part of, but that is still part of that conversation. So the next one, yes, sir.
Just real quick.
Yeah.
So with the gas tax, how do we recoup miles that are driven on private property?
So as far as recoup those funds, we don't.
Yeah, you said that was one of the problems with it, was we don't
Yeah.
calculate for miles driven on private property.
So
And I guess I'm saying with gas, we don't either.
Right, and I may have misstated that. The way that would work is similar to gas, where you are paying for miles that are driven on the private system, where this, with road usage charge and other technology, you could actually minimize that. Whereas now with motor fuels tax, yeah, if you drive on your property, checking cattle or what have you, you're paying potentially that motor fuels tax. Whereas if you had a road usage charge that was location-based, we could exclude that, and you wouldn't necessarily have to pay for that. You would only pay for the miles that you drove on the actual public highway system or the public roadway system. So yes, sorry.
I just sometimes heard as
stated that.
that is a problem with RUC, is you can't do that if you don't have location-based. And
Correct.
I don't
That's
think
a
that's a
challenge.
fair, I don't think that's a fair criticism because we don't take into account driving on private
Yep.
property now.
Yeah, no, and that is, yes. And that's one of the like challenges to determine how would you do this? It could be very simple, like you said, online form, submit that mileage. So the second piece, which addresses a little bit of this, is the odometer capture. So you would use a smartphone app that actually is Bluetooth connected to your vehicle, and you would take a picture of your odometer. And what they did was at the beginning of the pilot, they took a picture, and then every month they took a picture to record that mileage. With it being Bluetooth connected to your vehicle, you can identify that it's the same vehicle and it's actually the odometer reading as opposed to somebody just entering it in on a random number or a number on a website. So that would be another option that was there. That was another option that was provided. Stepping up in the technology level, a smartphone app that actually used location services. So that allowed you to actually identify the miles that you were driving in state and out of state. And that's important because we were also partnering with Minnesota and working with some of our other Midwestern states to show kind of what you would be collecting. Again, if they drove, say in Kansas City, and they drove a lot of miles in Missouri, that mileage would not be counted towards the mileage that they would be charged for. And they would get a statement at the end that basically reported that out. And we weren't collecting any funding or anything like that. This was purely a statement that showed, here's basically what you would have paid. Here's what the mileage that you potentially drove out of state if you chose that option. And here's how that is calculated. Then the last one was direct vehicle or inboard telematics. You'll notice there was 1% of our participants that used that. Part of that was just because of the fact of the sheer number of vehicles that actually have that availability. So there just aren't a whole lot of vehicles in that population, and we were only able to work with one auto manufacturer in this pilot. So there are several auto manufacturers that make these vehicles that have that, but we were only able to get one auto manufacturer to actually work with us on this pilot at the time. So just a few notes there. So preferences continued here. Really, the big things that we, I think, expected in some degree to see were really the privacy and transparency, the convenience factor. They want something that's convenient. They wanted a lot more information just about it. One interesting preference that we heard was participants were actually willing to pay an additional fee for convenience. So if it was more convenient for somebody to utilize, say for that smartphone app or for that higher technology, which would come at a cost ultimately to utilize, they were actually willing to pay anywhere from $1 to $5 a month. About 46% of that 52% was willing to pay $1 more a month, so $12 a year, to have that convenience available to them. So again, some important findings of interest. Talk a little bit about the familiarity and acceptance and trust findings. Of these, both the increase in support and comfort level were of interest or of note. Found and heard that really most of the participants would, and I say most, 61%, would prefer to have a state agency administering it over a private third-party entity. So that shows a lot, I think, about our state government and the credibility and the functionality of the state government in those regards. They actually think that that is a fairer way to do it than to go through a third party. The other one to note we thought, which was important, was the fact that the support actually grew from pre to post as far as what people thought of road usage charge as a potential alternative. It's not huge, but there was an increase in support of that idea or that concept as a possible option to consider. So again, I've mentioned a little bit about our rural and ag focus. Here, I think a note that's of interest to follow up with some more details that we didn't necessarily get is that rural participants did find RUC to be a fairer option than fuel tax. So I think that's an interesting note that we learned here, and we need to delve a little deeper into that. So our survey questions, to try and really get people to respond, they were relatively short and simple questions. But I think that the crux of this is, how does that play into whether or not people are thinking that far into kind of what we just talked about, what the chairman asked as far as like private and public road use mileage? Is that a possible consideration? We don't know. So that's something that we really think can be further explored or should be further explored as the state considers this as possibly an option amongst other options that are being looked at. Other interesting piece of this was that most ag participants did see a need for change. So that was kind of interesting to hear. Again, I think a lot of our agricultural participants that are in the ag industry really see this transportation network as a critical piece of their business. And that's not surprising. It is. Helps us get our food and grain and other commodities to market. So with that, couple of remaining findings, and then we'll close things out here quick. Some of the functionality considerations, again, what we learned, people that participated really did find that it was actually pretty easy to participate in. That's important, because if you find and want something to actually be feasible to utilize, then you need to have something that's easy and acceptable to use. Biggest challenge we heard were actually people that really just had some problems with the technology, getting it set up. Not a lot, but we did hear that. And then really a lot of participants preferred to pay either monthly or quarterly. I know a lot of talk about in the past about annual registration rates. That's a concern. I mean, everybody feels the pain once a year. How much do I have to pay for my annual registration? A lot of that's tied to property tax, but it's still a pain. And to add in another piece to that every year would be an additional consideration. So last one is really, this is probably one of the key things that maybe some of you folks have been waiting for, and that's the administrative cost considerations. Road usage charge is nowhere near as efficient to collect as a revenue mechanism as it is for motor fuels tax. Motor fuels tax is pretty much invisible to everybody as far as that goes. I think, as I mentioned earlier, 24 cents on the gallon, people, it's never really shown or seen in your cost. It's just $3.50, $2.50. I don't know what I'm paying that actually goes to the roads. And we only, as a state, collect that tax, what's called at the rack, which is from the distributors. So there are only technically about a few dozen distributors that we're collecting that tax from, not almost 3 million people who are registered or citizens of Kansas, with almost 3 million vehicles registered in the state. So again, those are things to be considering. If you did this online form, which was a simple form, it's a lot cheaper, because again, it's just setting up a website. There would be some quality control that we'd need to have to put into place, but there's a lot of considerations that we did not under this pilot or study explore. And then if you were to go up in technology, it goes up in cost. And that's where it was interesting to note that of the participants, to get that convenience, there was an interest by several to say we would pay a little extra to get that. And I think bottom line is, it could be seen as they could find a cost savings for that if they were to use that functionality. So bit of a high-level comparison here. These are just a few pros and cons to a couple of the different revenue mechanisms that I just talked about, and the one that we're familiar with. I won't run through all of those just for time's sake, but you can see that there are differences that we would need to consider as we move forward with any alternative revenue stream that the state were to consider. And then second to last here, it is a potential solution, but it's not the only one. There are other solutions that are out there that could be considered, that could be explored. So I think the idea is showing here, these are our current revenue streams for transportation investment. The lighter blue circle essentially is one of several different options that could be utilized. And you'll notice there is not an arrow going to anything from that, because that could be yet to be considered, where it would be similar probably in a lot of ways to the motor fuels tax, state motor fuels tax. Split it out so that we are ultimately utilizing that funding for the roads that are being used at both the local and the state level. And last, I will leave you with some potential next steps for you guys to be thinking about, and that is continued conversation about funding. Considering RUC as a diversified mix, part of the revenue mix, investigating other alternative mechanisms. Continuing to look at the viability of these alternative mechanisms, because again, as we talked about, motor fuels tax in the long run is not sustainable. Continue to work with our Midwest partners, and then again, stay engaged at the national level. Those are some of our next steps for consideration. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll say thank you, and here for questions.
Representative Bohai.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for this enlightening presentation. If we could get more of this chart going further back in time, I would appreciate that.
Sure. So of the revenues that from motor fuels tax.
Right. So like
Yeah.
it's a very compelling chart right now, but I'd like to see like back to maybe 2000.
Sure. Happy to get that.
Thank you.
Representative Vaughn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a multi-part question here. So I was wondering, so you surveyed people about submitting their odometer readings, either monthly or quarterly. The thought occurred to me, it would make sense just to submit your reading when you paid your registration every year, and then you just do that on an annual basis. It's less administratively burdensome, but it sounds like from what you said, that's a less attractive option, because then you're paying it as a lump sum. Is that kind of the philosophy?
That was kind of the understanding that we took from what their preference was as to how often they would pay. And then, so if they would pay on monthly or quarterly, we would need to have some level of what they would pay. And so that helps distribute it out or space it out. So yeah, you wouldn't have one large lump sum. Hawaii, who does not suffer the consequence that all the rest of us do, where we have interstate travel, does that one time a year registration with, and they are one that actually is implementing a program starting this year to do EV road usage charge with basically that simple odometer reading.
So that kind of leads me to my next question. So I'm kind of curious logistically how it works. Like, how do you exclude, for example, driving on private property or driving out of state? If you're just submitting images of the odometer reading, how is that excluded? And then conversely, for out-of-state travelers, right now we recoup motor fuels tax from them when they come into the state. So how do we recoup that cost from that group of people when, they don't live here, but they travel and use our roads?
Two fantastic questions. The first one is actually the odometer reading with a smartphone app or a collection wouldn't actually be able to identify or address private road use or private versus public road use mileage. It would be more specifically to help provide some accountability as to that number that's being reported, as opposed to somebody just going into a website. They could end up inadvertently doing a typo, and it creates a negative mileage or something along those lines. Secondarily, yes, your second question is a fair one and a very good one, that we don't have a good way to actually do that now through road usage charge. I think the idea would be, and what has been discussed at the federal level, is that a federalized standard, if that were to become something, would help do that and provide that, similar to the federal funding where that happens. There are multiple ways to try and fix that problem, but all of them rely on technology and then interstate agreements. I am not as familiar as the chair is regarding the IFTA process, but I know with IFTA, with commercial motor vehicles, they actually report by formula or provide funding by formula, even with the motor fuels tax that's collected to state. That gets then distributed to states based on the miles that they drive. That's based on logbooks that they actually have to provide. So there is a way to try and emulate that with this, but again, it would have to be at a national or even at least a regional level, because you'd have to have the partnerships between the different states for interstate movement.
And just to tag on to that real quick, once you start doing that, then there becomes a whole bunch of people that are concerned about their privacy and Big Brother knowing where they are.
Correct.
Go ahead.
That actually kind of led to my next question. So what happens if people don't report? I mean, I'm thinking, even for me, like, what if I forget to report in a given month, or, I don't keep track of, when I'm out of state or in state, or just, I could think of different scenarios where someone may not choose to report. So what is the follow up to that? Like, the word is escaping me, but like, what's the accountability there? How do we actually recoup that
And
cost?
it falls back to like quality control and quality checks, essentially. And the Turnpike can talk a little bit about some of this, and that's leakage, essentially, where people don't pay by way of either they have a blacked out license plate, not the one that we're actually have introduced, no, not that, but something that's not visible or it's covered. There is that concern of leakage ultimately, and that's part of that challenge is how do you remove or mitigate as much of that challenge as possible? I think even the Turnpike can tell you right now that they still, no matter what level of technology they still have a certain percent of leakage that they have to go through some form of collections that is set forth in some policy at the state level to allow them to collect off of Kansans that are registered in the state, but then they do a separate collection service where they actually will go to a collector essentially to get folks that are from out of state. And I don't know their success rate at getting that, but it is a challenge that will need to be considered as we as a state start talking about this.
Representative Hoheisel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Joel, for being here today in this presentation. I've been looking forward to this for a while. I can't remember if you joined us in Salt Lake a few years ago for the National Ruck. I was there with, I think I remember you in there now. Kind of want to just slide 8, by 2040, the motor fuels tax revenue. I'm looking at it and I understand we're thinking long-term here and we're thinking how we're going to fund the next highway transportation plan. But I am a little concerned on even getting through this transportation plan now and Ike. With these numbers and with what inflation is doing, are we going to be able to afford finishing out Ike and doing all the projects we want under Ike?
So I'm not sure how best to be able to answer that. As far as I'm aware, we are currently projecting out through 2029 ultimately to say that we would still be able to meet those commitments that we've made. Part of what we do through the local consult process and under Ike is that rolling program where we've got projects that are in the development pipeline and the construction pipeline compared to previous programs under the CTP and the T-Works program where we had committed to and identified projects pretty much at year 1. And those were the challenges of trying to meet that. However, everything that we are currently committed to and what we are looking at committing to, we feel confident that we can fund that. Now, we may be ultimately able to do less work in the out years than what we maybe had originally anticipated based on that inflation, especially based on the inflation. But that's yet to be seen. We really are, as we're projecting just a few years out, we see that as still something that we can meet.
Okay, and I appreciate that answer. I have 2 projects in Wichita that you're probably aware of that kind of big deals down there that I believe we need to get finished. Has there been any discussion about bonding even more than we have been?
Not to my knowledge, and we do have the ability, so under Ike, we have the ability to bond, and I'll have to get that information, a certain amount. We are not at that amount yet. We are still issuing, we're issuing bonds this year and I believe next year to help with the program moving forward. But those were already planned outlays.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate your answers on this, because that to me, and again, I know we're thinking long-term, we're thinking next transportation plan, but when I see that dip from today even to 2029 and inflation on top of it, I'm just a little worried that we're not gonna be able to get all the projects in Ike done, but I appreciate that. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Delperdane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Got a few questions if I can run them by him, but looking on slide 7 where you had the $100 for the EV and the breakdown of the various gas vehicles, but on an EV, does any money today go toward Fed? Because if you look on these, there's a state tax and there's a federal gas tax, but does anything from an EV go to the feds?
No, it is all state, collected state funding that comes in, because it's tied to the Kansas registration. And all of the federal dollar or federal motor fuel tax, that equates back in a sense. We are not a donor nor a donee state in the federal eye. So with all of the funds that we collect through federal motor fuels tax, we essentially get back from the federal government as part of our formula dollars. But no, all of the registration rate fees actually stay in the state.
Okay. Then you had the,
Can I do a commentary on that? It's even worse than the feds don't get anything. They pay you to buy an EV car. They
That
give
is
you a
true.
huge tax credit. So,
that's true.
I mean, talk about the big swing there.
Yeah.
Sorry for that commentary.
No, and then, well, you had the $100. I think we ran a bill to kick that up by 65%, so that might balance it a little bit.
Yeah, correct. And I may have glossed over it too quickly. I apologize. But yeah, this is all based on current. And then we do have 2121 that if it does get enacted, that goes up to 165. And there's actually a further split of those hybrids to go from the hybrid that's now includes a battery electric vehicle as well as a plug-in hybrid, and that's 50. It would split those out, if I understand correctly, to a battery electric, which would be 85 a year, and then 100 for a plug-in hybrid.
Right, okay. And I think everybody's gonna realize real quick how complex of an issue this really is, and it truly is. Slide 16, you had online forms, submit odometer readings to a website. I'm a car collector, so I've got several cars, and I currently do this with my insurance. Once a year, because they're limited to maybe 1,500 miles a year or so. You have to document each year. So there's already mechanisms for that to happen. You could say it's an invasion of privacy or not, but that's just what it is. So, and then same slide for the smartphone app. Curious how that would work, because how would the smartphone know if I'm riding with you, or I'm in an Uber, or I'm on a choo-choo train going from Wichita up to Topeka? How would it
So, great questions. And actually, the technology is there that in the case that you and your wife, or you and some of your kids or whoever all have smartphones, and everybody ends up connecting via Bluetooth to your car, because technology allows for multiple phones now to be connected to a car, which still astounds me, but because I don't want to compete with my kids on what their music's getting played. Anyway, it actually will default to the first device that's connected to the Bluetooth car, or by Bluetooth to the car, and will not connect to both. So say you and your wife have vehicles. Your wife's primary vehicle is connected to her phone and your primary vehicle is connected to your phone, essentially. So it would not count for both. And then it has to have a Bluetooth connection in order to activate, ultimately to collect. So if you're on the train, you're not connected to your car, basically. You could be connected to Bluetooth headphones or to whatever, and that will filter out. I will tell you that we did have one experience within our pilot where somebody was recorded for actually going on a run with their Bluetooth headphones. And so we recognize that. And that's part of the benefit of doing these pilots, is to really explore what are the challenges. And so they were able to identify that was actually an issue, and we're able to then separate that out and make some corrections by way of the technology.
But the potential exists if you allow me to Bluetooth to your vehicle, or so if I jump in before you and you come in to drive, then I'm getting charged for it then.
So it will show you on a screen to confirm that you're connecting to that car. So ultimately, then same thing, like you wouldn't be double charged. You could say, no, it's not my car. Then the other person.
Then final question was, I was keyed up on 19, but I don't know if you're familiar with 21st Street going through Wichita, but it heads west and it goes out to rural communities throughout Kansas. But you get a little bit west of Wichita, there is a tremendous amount of cattle truck property or traffic, cattle truck traffic. And every other year or so, they end up resurfacing this road. So again, what's it cost to resurface a road? And it's because of the cattle truck traffic. How do you capture something like that separate? I mean, it's not from an EV or an occasional car driving out there.
So we do traffic counts on all of our highways, regular traffic counts through all the segments to actually get AADT, which is annual average daily traffic, that we are able to average out and calculate. And it also will split out whether it's a car or a commercial motor vehicle based on classification. So if you're driving through there, you may see tubes that are out, black little tubes across the roadway. That's actually collecting the number of cars. Every time it gets hit, it has a calculation based on that, the spacing of the axles to identify whether it's a car or a truck or so on and so forth. So that's how we identify like the average daily traffic by way of different vehicle types. To talk to the point I think that you're getting at for funding perspectives or for resurfacing perspectives, we don't fund specific projects based on who drives on it necessarily. It's a broad consideration across the entire state as to how we are funding all of our projects. So it's not like the motor fuels tax or the diesel fuel tax pays for a certain road project. It's all of the state highway funds. So
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate it.
Representative Weigel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your presentation. I'm listening to all this and maybe I missed it. What information is captured if you put these, whatever kind of device, what information is captured to identify the ruck, so to speak?
By way of virtue with the smartphone app that uses GPS location, it uses a GPS location and then the miles that are driven based on pings that your phone has. So your phone pings every so often, and then there's a pretty intricate algorithm that actually will calculate the miles based on the location of the highway, essentially, because the phone is not pinging literally every half second or anything. It pings every, I don't know exactly the technology, but it does. And then there's that ability to then calculate the miles. So by way of using the smartphone app with the GPS, it identifies essentially kind of where you are and then the number of miles that are driven during that trip. The smartphone app that actually does the photo odometer reading, essentially all that does is recognize that you are taking a picture of the odometer of the car that is actually registered within the system.
Okay.
So that you're not taking a picture of one car one day and then another car another day.
See, that was part of a different day, or even the same day, stop, get out, get into a different car and go somewhere. Does the technology allow you to differentiate between, say, a Cadillac and a 1970 Pinto?
I'm guessing that the Pinto doesn't have the technology to allow you to connect via Bluetooth unless you, so those would be some of the issues that still would have to be addressed through further exploration of how this system could work. I can't say one way or another how it would work from something that has Bluetooth technology to something that doesn't, short of I don't think it would. But when you change vehicles, you would still have to connect into the Bluetooth to connect to the actual car if you were driving a different car. Similar to what Representative Delperdang was asking as far as who in a vehicle connects ultimately and then is recording that mileage, because you could have more than one phone, just like you could have more than one vehicle that's collecting it. It opens up another question that you may be asking about, and that would be not so much brand, but vehicles, like whether you're in your vehicle or in a rental vehicle. And those questions still need to be sought out and looked at and explored. That's a lot of that stuff, we did not get into that level of specificity within the study.
Okay. And just one final little question on when they get this information and say somebody sells that car or is in a wreck, something like that. Does that information go away, or is that still captured somewhere? If it is, where is it at?
So that's a lot of another good question. A lot of what would have to be built into the system, because it raises the question of how much information how long are you keeping that data or information? And really, what we understand is the information or the data isn't kept for a long period of time. It's only kept through that reporting period, if not like the next couple of reporting periods, and then it's clear out, because otherwise that's a whole lot of space, allowing you, the state or the entity, to ultimately do some quality control as to any sort of audits on to make sure that it's actually accurate and correct.
All right.
I don't know that there's I don't have a good answer for you, because we haven't really got to that point in this state in that exploration. Again, that's something that would need to be addressed. I don't discount that.
Thank you for your response. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions? Representative Goddard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Boy, wasn't it simple when we all drove gas guzzlers? Okay. I just cannot imagine how complicated this whole thing is, because no matter what the final outcome is, there's going to be a piece missing someplace along the line. And I don't have a question, but it's really complicated. I think that probably we can learn a lot of things from other states and, rob from them for certain issues. But I guess I do have a question. Do you have any kind of an idea of if we go to the RUC, when that it would it be implemented, and would it be implemented in time to offset that delta, the decrease in the gas tax revenues?
So I think that's a question I would pose back to you all, because ultimately this dialogue needs to be in this body, and more than just this body, in this building, essentially, because there are a lot of, as you mentioned, a lot of complexities to this potential option, as well as any other option. Trying to explore something that's not familiar, that's new, that hasn't been operated for the past multiple decades, is going to provide us with a lot of questions and challenges to try and find solutions to.
Well, I'm sure there are going to be several more briefings as we go down this road. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Delperdang.
Thanks for letting me go a second time. Are you guys doing much thinking or discussing on future technologies coming down the road? And that I'm thoroughly convinced with some of the technology I'm reading on just the batteries. There's fuel cells and other things, but even on batteries, we're going to get to the point we can recharge those in 5 minutes from the proper stations. At that point in time, do we put a fuel tax on a per kilowatt that's going into that battery, just like a per gallon charge? And would that fix a lot of this?
So that's another possible solution that actually has had a bill introduced a couple of different years, as far as doing a kilowatt hour charge tax, essentially. What I would say to that question is you replace one fuel type charge with another fuel type charge. And you could put yourself as a legislature in the same position you're in the future, looking at now, how do we replace the motor fuels tax with how would we replace the kilowatt hour charge based on a new technology, say hydrogen fuel cells, like you said.
Yeah, but
How would you would continually have to look at the new technologies. Not to say that, again, road usage charge isn't without its flaws. The road usage charge, you're considering the roadway as the utility you're using. So all people use that utility ultimately, regardless of whether they use hydrogen, fuel, battery, anything. So that maybe makes it simpler for you all to consider if you look at something that you don't have to reconsider in a few years down the road or
But I
few
also
decades.
think out of the box a little bit, because right now, you and I pull into a gas station. That gas station buys that fuel somewhere on the wholesale market and they retail it. We've got to get it to the point where the power companies, whoever they are out there, can supply power to the fuel station at a wholesale rate and they retail it and put on the proper road taxes and everything else. To me, it doesn't sound that complex, but yet the technology has to evolve to make that happen.
It does, and then the other issue with all of this is depending on the fuel type, like again, going back to the battery charging, like for a Tesla or for a Nissan Leaf, most people that drive those don't charge at public charging stations. They actually charge at home, which would require then every homeowner to have some sort of separate meter or special meter on that for that vehicle ultimately to do. And so it does. It's just one more consideration, but it is another option to consider.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
And just to add on to that, we have state sales tax on kilowatt hour sales. If you figure the average kilowatt hour cost, and then you work that sales tax onto it, it's roughly equivalent to a 24-cent gas tax already.
True, but we could make it so any power going to these retail recharging stations, they're taxed separately. I mean, in a format similar to the gas tax. I mean,
We could. It'd just be another regulatory
Sure.
scheme on top of what we already have, and what we already have is roughly equivalent to what the gas tax is now.
Right.
And then again, as he mentioned earlier, 80%, I think they say 80% of the charging happens at home in your garage. And as far as separate metering, I mean, most of them are doing just plugging their car into a 110-volt outlet. So it's practically impossible to stop the cheating. Other questions? You've got a representative, you've got a EV, don't you?
I do. I would
I'm
echo.
sorry, I wasn't trying to make a political point.
I'd echo my colleague over there's opinion that I do think that EVs and somehow getting them to have their fair share of the tax on road usage. So I'm just looking at my my vehicle. So we actually we use superchargers with frequency. We plug in every night, and actually it's 220. 110 is super slow. It'll take almost 20 hours. So 220 is what most superchargers, home chargers use. I'm looking here at the last, so Topeka service area, 1176, Overland Park supercharger, $12.22. Joplin, Missouri, $10.85. So typically we'll run our Tesla down to like 60 miles, 80 miles left. So, that's probably putting, those are 12-minute charges, 15-minute charges, whatever. I just think that those are pretty skinny numbers when I compare filling up my vehicle, my SUV, if, to go 400 miles. So I think maybe there's some potential there to, to charge these, to have some sort of a tax on superchargers or chargers in general that are commercial. And then I think a second thing that was mentioned is home chargers. I sit on the energy committee as well, so I don't want to be so I'm not trying to raise people's energy costs. But I think if there was maybe another way to potentially charge or bill for charging a fee for charging your vehicle. I mean, I think that'd be something to look into. But, yeah.
Okay, any other questions? I've got just a couple. So you said that people were willing to pay for convenience. Did anybody ask to switch methods in the pilot? Did they say, gosh, we're really tired of taking this picture and send it in? Can we go to the cell phone app?
No, actually, we didn't have anybody say that they wanted to switch. As a matter of fact, it was quite the opposite. We heard that most people were very satisfied with the choice that they made.
My next question is, you said that real participants find the rec to be fairer than the fuel tax. That's not anecdotally what I hear in my forums at home. Is that something that changed from the beginning to the end?
So that is something that changed from the beginning to the end, and that was only the pilot participants. So again, we've got a small percentage, and as I mentioned, that's something that I think is worth exploring further as to delving deeper into the reasons that really was the focus or the comment.
And then you talked about the different costs, and I understand that as you go to scale, that the cost per account would go down for the clients. But what was the cost to service the telematic? Do you have that? And the GeoToll? GeoToll is the smartphone app that they use, and we should have probably had them come in. We can maybe have them come in next year. I mean, that technology is moving, but do you remember what the cost per client was for those two?
I do not, but I can get that for the committee.
Anyway, I think this is intriguing. I have felt for a long time now that there's intermediate solutions to our funding program, and I think Representative Hoheisel's bill was an important step in that way. But then there will be long-term solutions. But I don't think, and as we make all of these decisions, we've got to not lose track of the collection efficiency of the fuel tax. So, there's a lot of fear out there by people that they're going to force me off gas to go to electric. And I don't see any way where, as far as with the tax collection efficiency, we can really do that. I think this is a way to provide parity for those that are using EVs and stuff like that. So any other questions? All right. Thank you very much, Joel. I know you've worked really hard on this for the last couple of years. And then isn't CDM Smith consulting engineers that you guys worked with extensively?
Yeah, CDM Smith and Burns McDonald was a sub on the contract that we used. And we had some smaller vendors and contract, like you said, with GeoToll, then Stellantis, which was the auto manufacturer that ultimately then participated with the pilot to help us actually do the pilot. So, yeah.
Thanks for your good work on this. All right, committee. Tomorrow we're going to have a hearing on SB 8. That's a move over bill. I don't know if you're aware of this, but currently if you see a emergency vehicle on the side of the road, law enforcement, utility vehicles, if you can safely do it, you need to move over. This would just expand that so that if you see Pat Proctor out there changing his car flat, that you need to move over also. So anyway, if you've got thoughts on that, make sure you read that bill and understand that it already came through the Senate. Also, Meg has mailed out the minutes for January 14th, 16th, 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 27th, 28th, and 29th. If you would make sure that you would glance through those, see if you've got any issues with those minutes, and we'll try to approve those tomorrow also. Representative Proctor, it's really not a...
Mr. Chairman, I'm just like to say thank you for not saying that I'm on the side of the road because I'm such a bad mechanic that my car's broke. Thank you.
Yeah, did you have something, Representative Elperdang?
Last year, didn't we run the move over bill? What happened to it?
I don't think we did a move over bill last year. I think we did texting and construction zone and school zone.
It had to do with people who are on the side of the road with flashers on. I ran one a couple of years ago and it did not get heard, but I thought we ran it last year and it made it through.
Yeah, some of these feel like Groundhog Day, once in a while.
Yeah.
So maybe we did.
But if we did, are we doing it again or what?
Well, this
the
time,
Senate?
This time the Senate has already passed it, so
That's
we
different.
may have a
Well,
little
that's
more left.
different.
I wasn't wanting to cast aspersions on our body across the rotunda. So anyway, Anything else for the committee? If not, we're adjourned. Thank you very much.